Okay. Okay, we're going to put you over there. Yeah.
All right, we are ready to start. Those of you on the upper level, just take your seats as quickly as you can. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to see you after this afternoon's opening exercises and now for our discussion of the pre-read book. Once again, I'm Dean Jill Dolan, and I'm really delighted to see you all here. So you should know that this is the first time that we've held the pre-read assembly in Jadwin Gym. I was going to say that it's not quite as hot as it was on Cannon Green or in the front lawn of Nassau Hall this afternoon, but I'm not sure that's true. So I want to thank you for your patience and your perseverance as we move through the program this evening. I see you fanning. Please keep doing that. There are water fountains right over there if anyone needs them. We're learning some things about doing this in Jadwin, so thank you for being the first class of students with whom we've done this event here. I also want to urge you to make this the first of, I hope, many times that you come to Jadwin to see some of our athletic teams play. It does get cooler in here as the year progresses. I also want to know how many of you are student athletes. Just raise your hand if you're a student athlete. All right, then. Let's hear it for our student athletes. At Princeton, our athletes are scholars, and we are delighted that they are among us. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's pre-read speakers. They'll speak for about 30 to 45 minutes and then open the floor for your questions, which you can pose from microphones that are strategically placed around the floor. On the ground floor, there's one here, here, and there. On the top floor, there's 4 microphones, there, and there. So do get your questions ready and don't be shy about posing them. I'm going to come back after the remarks and I will call on people standing at the microphones. Please feel free to line up. So first, you heard him speak today, but let me introduce to you again the 20th president of Princeton University, Christopher L. Eisgruber.
Thank you.
President Eisgruber is a member of Princeton's great class of 1983. He took office as president in July of 2013 after 9 years as the university's provost. He's the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Public Affairs and one of the world's best-known constitutional scholars. If you ever have an opportunity to take a seminar from President Eisgruber, I highly recommend him as a teacher. Speaking with President Eisgruber this evening about his terrific book, Every Day the River Changes, is Jordan Salama, a member of Princeton's great class of 2019. Jordan lives in New York and is a resident writer on staff for National Geographic. He's written essays on climate change, letter writing, and American Jewish life. He's tracked down Syrian traveling salesmen in the Andes and traveled across America by train, among many other adventures. Every Day the River Changes was named a Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2021 and a top new travel book by the New York Times. Jordan's also worked on TV shows, including 60 Minutes and Sesame Street, and he has co-created... He has co-created the Lulu's TV, an English-Spanish children's digital music series on YouTube that has more than 1 million total subscribers and nearly 500 million views from around the world. I am sure that after tonight there'll be 1.5 million total subscribers. Please join me in welcoming President Chris Eisgruber and Jordan Salama. Thank you.
So Jordan, first of all, thanks for coming back, and welcome back to Princeton.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, this is just a huge honor and really unreal to think that 7 years ago I was sitting in a similar assembly to this.
So that's where I want to start with questions. Is just, how does it feel now to be up here? Where are your thoughts going as you think back to having been in an audience exactly like this 7 years ago?
It feels like I'm a first-year student again, honestly. I feel the excitement, and I think that it was just such a warm welcome walking even just into the gym to hear people so excited about the book and so excited about coming to Princeton and being here. But I remember very vividly what it was like to be sitting in that pre-read assembly, which was in the Carter Theater, and that it was just kind of the first moment when we were all together talking about one specific book. It was special.
And when you were there, I mean, talk a little bit about what your aspirations were, or how you were thinking about your Princeton experience. Did you sit in the audience and say, hey, in 7 years, I'm going to be on that stage?
Definitely not that. And definitely did I not expect that the Lulus would be getting an introductory remark at the beginning of this. But no, I think that when I was coming into Princeton, I had this sense that it was a place where magical things could happen. Let's say that. I mean, that people were working on these projects that were really inspiring and then taking those projects into the real world. And I knew that that was something that I wanted to do with my work here from the start. I also knew that I wanted to tell stories and be a writer, but I didn't necessarily know what kind of writer I wanted to be. I thought I wanted to work in television and write comedy shows, and who knows what the future will bring. I did not think that I'd be writing a nonfiction book, less a nonfiction book that is bringing me back here to talk about, my travels in Colombia for a group of incoming students.
So you say a bit in the book as it goes along about how this project started to germinate for you as you were at Princeton, but now that you've got an audience here of Princeton students, maybe you could say a little bit more just about the moments where this took shape and maybe some of the important connections you made. I know some of those people are actually here in the audience, but how did this project begin to take shape in your mind?
Definitely. I mean, this project, I like to say, happened as the result of a series of coincidences, and in some cases, actually a series of rejections, too. I ended up in Colombia the very first time, as I mentioned in the book, after my first year at Princeton for about a month, traveling throughout the country, working for a wildlife organization, documenting on camera and in writing the experiences of people who I met in different, natural environments throughout the country. And that was important to me, I think, because, again, I didn't know what kind of writer I wanted to be. Here I was kind of in a place that I found to be filled with stories and interesting people. And the key here is that I went at the advice and the willing of a family friend who also happened to teach me piano when I was 5 years old, whose grandmother took me into her house in the city of Cali. Now, when I say took me into her house, as many of you know from the book, this was a very kind of loose arrangement. But the key was that she did not let me leave the house after 7 p.m. when the sun went down. She would take the key to bed with her, and that would kind of be it. And I remember sitting out by the window listening to a soccer game happening at a stadium not far away from where I was staying and watching it on TV and just wishing that I could be outside in the moment. But the days I had to make do. What I did during those nighttime times when I was basically under kind of like an informal curfew in my friend's grandmother's house, was I started to keep a journal. A journal that was nothing more than just the chance to write down what was happening to me, what I was seeing and what I was feeling and what I was experiencing. Some things were personal, but most of it was just the kinds of experiences that I was having. And that, the very first time, was what I was doing. That was the very first time that I was doing what ended up turning into this book. I just didn't realize it at the moment.
At what point then did you start thinking, okay, I'm writing things down, and this is a kind of storytelling, and maybe it can become part of my academic work at Princeton? Was that a conversation with a faculty member or a friend, or just sort of an inspiration?
It was best coincidence number 2, which was that I applied for a class at about 11:45 p.m. the night before the deadline to apply to the class, which is an experience all of you are going to have 100%.
But it's not our officially recommended process.
No, definitely not. But hey, things happen, and we know how these things go, right? But I applied for this class. It was called Creative Nonfiction. It was taught by a professor on the journalism faculty here named John McPhee. And John McPhee is a writer who I deeply admire. And at that time, I didn't necessarily know that I was interested in nonfiction writing. Maybe I didn't even know what nonfiction writing was. Dare I say that? Because I didn't really read magazines when I was a kid. But I took this class, and in conversations with Professor McPhee, who was interested in a lot of the same things that I was, stories about people and nature and history and culture, I realized, hey, there's a career or either at least an academic career that can be made out of having these kinds of encounters and writing these kinds of stories down as a way of learning about the world. And so that kind of formalized this idea that, you know what, yeah, I wanted to write about my time in Colombia or my time in Latin America more broadly in a more formal way as my work in school at Princeton. Yeah.
And just say a little bit, this became your senior thesis, and again, it's an unusual and creative kind of senior thesis. How did that happen?
Again, not in a linear way. I mean, I guess it might seem from the book that I went from coming to Princeton, going to Columbia for the first time, learning more that I wanted to write these kinds of stories, and then going back to Columbia to finish what I'd started. That's totally not what happened. I had all of these ideas. Again, ideas that a lot of you will have these kinds of experiences in your time here, where you will be thinking that you want to do so many different kinds of things, and you're not quite sure which one is the one that's going to stick. But I pursued a bunch of different options, and what ended up bringing me back around was remembering that in those nighttime journals from that curfew in Cali, Colombia, I remembered that a lot of people told me that if there was one place in Colombia filled with stories, it was this river called the Magdalena. I wanted to write about a river. I thought that was attractive to me because it was very simple. I didn't want to write a complicated structure for a thesis, and on a river, you don't have to worry about where you're going. You have a start and an end point. You just have to kind of take the path down, and yeah, there are some curves and stopovers along the way, but at least that is laid out for you. And in a time, for me, like being in college, not a lot of stuff is laid out for you like that. There's a lot of question marks. There's a lot of decisions that you have to make. And I thought, if at the very least, I wouldn't have to worry about the direction of my travel, my physical travel, writing about a river would be nice. And so that's how I found my way back to the Magdalena. And I had these experiences and encounters with people that were amazing. And I didn't expect that. While I was there, even was thinking it was maybe a failed trip at some points. But then I came back and started thinking about it more and the greater meaning of those conversations. And I was like, this is something special.
So let's start. We may want to come back to what happened at Princeton or what happened afterwards a little later in the conversation. But let's start making that transition, as you just talked about, down to the Magdalena River. You started to plan this trip, and it is a trip to a place that was, in some respects, dangerous. You say not as dangerous as people thought. But how did you start to think about that? Were you worried?
Yeah, I mean, it's travel to a complex place, and I think that a lot of us take these kinds of trips and have to have these considerations that we bring in when we travel anywhere complex, even within the United States. And I was worried because that first trip to Colombia was the first time that I ever traveled to basically any place. It was the first time I also traveled to a foreign country by myself.
It was the first time you were traveling to a foreign country, and the woman with whom you were staying, as you just said a moment ago, she wouldn't let you out at night because her judgment was that's a little too dangerous. Right?
It wasn't cruel. It was like the absolute opposite. It was her way of keeping me safe. I had traveled, before, but not by myself. And I think that being alone, well, there's differences in being alone and being by oneself. I think that I traveled by myself, but I was never alone because I made it a point to kind of combat the worries that I had and maybe that other people had for me by setting up people to receive me in every single community that I visited along the way, because I knew that if somebody who I trusted had a friend who would be in charge of trusting me or of being my trusted contact on the ground, it would be not only a successful trip in terms of my own safety, but it would be a successful trip in the sense that I already had a local perspective who could be my bridge, my guiding eye to be the person who could bring me into these worlds where I was definitely an outsider.
Did you ever feel at risk during the trip? I mean, there are these moments in the narrative, right? I mean, even on your first little introduction with Kolo and Wismar, that's before the trip, but you're talking to them, and they sound like they're planning a murder.
They're not planning a murder.
They're just describing
they're
one
describing
in
a
the town.
murder that was to be happening. I mean, there are these undercurrents, I think, as with a lot of complex places about there is a long-running conflict that's happening in these places, and you have to understand that impacts people's everyday lives. But what happened with me was that I went to great lengths to again establish these trustworthy connections with people, and also leave room to wing it and to kind of wing it safely, take calculated risks, and have serendipitous encounters, which ended up being some of the most beautiful for me in the book personally. But I think that when it comes down to it, No, I never felt that I was personally at risk during this trip, but that was because of the kind of preparation that I did going into it.
So let's talk a little bit. The trip begins in, your narrative account of the trip begins in Quinchana, and I've already asked Jordan to correct me if I mispronounce these names, which I'm sure I will over the course of the evening. I had the sense from something you said there that might not have been a planned part of the itinerary when you left Princeton, was it?
Totally not.
Totally not. So say a little bit about that. Why wasn't it, and then what changed?
Totally not. So to get to the source of the river, obviously you have to start in kind of a midpoint and travel back and like retrace your footsteps a little bit. So I started in Girardot, which is a chapter, the next kind of chapter in the geographic sense of the river. And there, people were telling me, they were like, well, you can go to San Agustin, to that town, was kind of, near Quinchana, but you really shouldn't go further. And it was because there were still these undercurrents of violence, and there were worries, and they were not living there necessarily, but they were living close, and they said, you should just be careful about it. But when I got to San Agustin, I found myself with two people, both of whom actually got connected to through a Princeton alumnus living in Bogota, which was really special. One was a public librarian who is the most well-read man that I've ever met in my life. And he's a bibliophile and a cinephile. He loves movies, he loves books. And he came to me and he said, if you want to write about this river, you got to go to Quinchana. And I promise you, I know the person who will go with you, who will make sure that nothing is going to happen to you. And he said it in a way with such conviction that I wanted to believe him, and I wanted to trust him, and I did. And so there entered Manuel Salamanca.
And you trusted him before you met Manuel Salamanca, is that right?
I trusted him before I met him.
So, all right, and there enters Manuel Salamanca.
Right, no, yeah, these are like chains of trust, basically. Like, you trust a person who trusts somebody that you know. It's complicated sometimes, but you have to think about it in a way that's reasonable and makes sense. So then enters Manuel Salamanca, who also, as a kind of well-renowned anthropologist throughout the country and in the region for his work on these megalithic statues in that area, also convinced me, said, I go all the time. It will be fine.
Was that a conversation you had by phone? Because as I remember, it seems like the first time you meet him is when you're getting together to catch this morning kind of ride on the back of a truck. Am I right about that?
That was the beginning of our real, deep time together.
You had met him before that?
The day before.
Okay.
The night before, we had this conversation where it did not happen over the phone, and I think that it was important that conversation happened in person for me to say, okay, it's all right for me to take this calculated risk, because in person, he was showing me pictures of the fact that he'd been there just a couple days ago. He was saying, this is what we will see. This is why it's important for you to understand this place and to tell this story, to get as close as you can to the source. Wow. He still didn't want me to go further. He didn't want me to go by foot up all the way to the actual lagoon where the Magdalena begins, but that was the closest, settlement of a town. And we went, and I'm so glad that we went, because that ends up being, as many of you may have seen, a really special time, and of course takes on later a very tragic meaning when I learned, when I was back in Princeton, what had been the fate of Manuel Salamanca. Yeah,
and say a little more. I know, it's a very poignant moment in the book when you talk about learning about his death, but here's this man who had such good judgment and whom you trusted to take you to Quinchana, and then he's the target of violence.
Yeah, I think that it's really, well, first of all, when it happened, I was sitting in East Pine, a building that if you already don't know, you will get to know, because it's one of the most beautiful buildings on campus. I was sitting in this classroom preparing for my thesis defense, which was the next day or 2 days later. And you have these classic Princeton, right? Big wood walls, heavy doors, and big arched ceilings, and you're sitting there, and then you hear something like this, that had happened. And you were there. But also you left, and you have the ability, the privilege to leave. How does that impact? I had already written my thesis, but that was not the point where the thesis became the book. That moment was really pivotal in how I approached the writing of what is now the actual book.
So is there an example you would give? How did that change your telling of the story?
I think that I realized that most of the people who I met along the way were social, environmental, or community leaders of some kind. I didn't necessarily figure that out when I was writing my thesis. Maybe I did kind of subconsciously, but I didn't overtly realize that. And when you look at somebody's role in their community in that way, with that perspective, especially the perspective of violence and risk and what could happen to that person just by nature of them doing what they are doing, it definitely didn't impact like me thinking back about my trip with him into the mountains and saying, wow, that was really irresponsible, I shouldn't have done that. Not the case. I still think that it was perfectly safe and fine, but I think that I didn't necessarily fully come to terms with the reality that a lot of people who I met were in danger of, because they were doing the work that they were doing to pull their communities out of certain kinds of violence.
Let me talk to you a little, or ask you to say a bit about these interactions that you had, both with people who were community leaders and everybody, it seems, whom you met along the Magdalena River. You enter into conversation with people, and as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, wow, how does Jordan do this? I could just, I don't know. I mean, you're meeting people you've never met before, and all of a sudden there's this conversation, and you're eliciting stories. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's like it's just kind of like being a regular person. I think I think that is what. Maybe I'm not a regular person.
A little more than that. I think.
Yeah. But I think that what it comes down to is that I entered these spaces first of all as a student, a young-looking student. I hopefully don't look that much different now than I did then. I was 21, right, and I'm 25 now, and I was, I wanted to learn. I wanted to have conversations, but I also just wanted to live life with people like they were living where they had their homes and their families. And so I did things like play music with people, play soccer with people, watch soccer with people, talk about interests that we had in common, because there were things that we had in common. And by starting the conversations with those things that might not have had anything to do with what the meat, so-called, of the book was, that opened the door to later on, maybe it was a few hours later, maybe it was a few days later, to have the conversations that were a little bit deeper and shed more light onto the way people lived. Because they trusted me, and I trusted them, and it wasn't a one-way street. That's the other thing. It's like, I wasn't there just kind of absorbing. I was also trying to offer my own vulnerabilities, my own questions, information about my own experiences in my own life. And I hope people picked up on that, because it ended up being a two-way street, and I think that so much of this book is about the value of having these kinds of conversations with people with empathy and respect, and how we can, cross these divides or, different lived experiences through first starting with common interests and then broadening it out to the more difficult, maybe, topics.
I mean, it almost seemed in some places where you were almost seeking out some of the eldest members of the community, which struck me as remarkable and unusual. I mean, if I look back to my own long ago, now youth, I think, wow, I wish I had taken the time to hear stories from people who were much older than I was, although at the time it seemed like there were barriers that were on me, I suppose. But tell me about how you approached people across so many different kinds of divisions.
Well, one point that I want to make about the elders of communities is that I think that how I kind of got into this, now I'm only realizing it now after the fact, but, way at the beginning, was that I come from a family of storytellers, not necessarily professional storytellers, but people who tried to tell the stories of their experiences, their migrations, their traumas even, through different kinds of mediums, whether it's one great uncle who's a painter, or my grandfather, abuelo, who keeps a big binder in his basement of photographs and things. And I heard these stories from those family members all my life. And I think that's what made me want to become a writer and tell those stories myself. First, it was a desire to document the stories of my own family, and then I got to Princeton and decided, wow, this can be applied in a global, in a kind of bigger scale. But the idea of elders having a lot to say was not lost on me when I was traveling a place like the Magdalena, seeking out people who could have very well been stand-ins for my own grandparents or aunts and uncles, and hearing their stories was important. And then just a couple weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a Brazilian journalist who I really respect, named Fabio Zucker, who wrote a great book about the Amazon rainforest, and he has this really, really cool technique where when he's doing anthropological research and journalism, kind of anthropological journalism, I guess you could call it, he likes to put the oldest members of a community in conversation publicly with some of the youngest. Kind of like we're doing now, with the community as the audience and him sitting in the middle.
I noticed you slipped that one.
Oh, yeah, that was...
There are elder people in the community.
Well, hold on. I mean the kind of conversation that we're having. And what comes out in those interactions, in those exchanges, must be so much richer, even more than just me having a conversation with an elder in the community. I tried to approach both the youngest and the oldest members of communities that I entered, but I now thinking back to it, I wonder what it would have been like to have them in conversation with each other.
That's really interesting. Did you ever have a time? I mean, it just seems that you reach out to people, and you, as you say, you have this openness, respect for them, and they respond similarly. Were there times where you tried to enter into a conversation with somebody and they just said, like, what the heck, right? Why American college student are you asking me all of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a degree of skepticism in every single one of these encounters, but I do think that it was clear very quickly who didn't want to talk to me on any level and who did. And the people who didn't want to talk to me on any level, like, I totally understand that. Sometimes I think, what would I do if I was sitting in my house and somebody knocked on my door? Yeah. I probably wouldn't answer the door. Like, I would not open the door to talk to that person, but people did, and that is a level of trust in itself. So if someone didn't feel comfortable talking to me, usually it was done in a very polite way, like, they'd say, oh, you want some coffee? And we'd talk about, like, very, like, polite small talk things, and I realized very quickly that this was not going in the way that, like, they were not interested, and that was totally fine. And I left that, conversation well. And there weren't really any cases where it was like a hostility thing, which was good.
So a lot of people were open to the conversations, even though we may assume that's more rare than it is. I want to ask you a bit about the narrative frame that you put on the book. That is how you put these stories together. There's a lot of stuff that's in the background, and sometimes it comes forward and it gets a couple of pages. I think about the political violence, for example, or the environmental degradation. And you could have written a book, right, which was structured not just by the river, but by the history of conflict in Colombia and how one got to peace and then what goes on. But I take it you made a decision that wasn't the kind of book you wanted to write, and say something about how you thought about that.
I made that decision at Princeton while I was writing my thesis, because I knew that I wanted to write a thesis that I could somehow turn into the beginning of a career as a journalist, as a writer for general audiences. So I knew that I was crafting something that was meant for, one, an American audience, but also an American audience of general readership. And me being, at the time, 21 and not necessarily an expert on anything, I still don't think I'm an expert on anything, I knew that I couldn't write an authoritative history on the river or the country or, basically anything at all, anywhere. And what I could write for a general audience was the story of one young person's journey down the river and how I experienced those encounters through my eyes and my perceptions of the exchanges that we had. And I think that at its heart is what this book is, and how it's different from plenty of other books that have been written, if you want to say about Colombia specifically, or the Magdalena River even specifically, that dive very deeply into those really important narratives. My goal was to use those narratives as context to understand the experiences of everyday life that I was having with people that I met along the way.
One theme that comes in from time to time, and I'm going to ask you to say a little more about it, is this theme about a golden age, which you sometimes put in quotes and occasionally don't, but a golden age on the Magdalena from about the 1920s to the 50s, and there are various places where this surfaces. How do you think about that period, and how do you feel about it? There's a point where I think you even say you read about those times with a bit of nostalgia and envy.
Because of the way people spoke about them.
Yeah.
I think that it's hard not to look at times that people speak of so fondly without that nostalgia and envy of, stories of vast rainforest, let's say, or a river that was healthy and that people had memories attached to, not that people still have memories attached to it, but people really felt strongly about that period. And it appears in the book again and again because it appeared again and again in the conversations that I was having. But I think that it was important to balance that idea of nostalgia and romanticizing maybe of the past with a lot of the more complex things that go on in places like the Magdalena River Valley, right? So always when talking about these kinds of things, I was thinking, well, what's influencing the way somebody's telling me this story, their memory of something? But at the end of the day, I mean, kind of on a broad scale across the river, people did look on this time with a feeling of reverence. And I wanted to reflect that, at least in some way, in this book. And it touched on every aspect of people's lives. The natural, the historical, right? From the hotel that was grand and beautiful that was kind of falling apart when I got there, and to the fishermen who said that there were just so many more fish.
I mean, for me, there was a kind of ironic tension around it, partly because you do such a good job of kind of illuminating the dignity of the lives that people are living, and also the kinds of hardships that they faced. And there were these thoughtful recollections of a grander age, but there was also kind of an argument. Again, it was kind of, in some ways, a subtle theme within the book, but that older age, which was partly colonial, had produced some of the hardships that were now rendering these lives so much more difficult than those ones from a golden age.
Absolutely. And those were the kinds of conversations that I wanted to open up, at least opening up the idea for readers to start to think about those things in the book, because I think that working with my editor, when this was turning from a thesis into a book, we were thinking about how this could be travel writing for a new generation of readers. I am actually curious, for a show of hands, of anybody who's read a travelogue before this, like of this kind.
See one.
Like really, really few.
Two. Yeah.
Okay. So
it's a new kind of travel book.
It's a new kind of travel book, and I think that that there's a need for that, because there is power in journeys that can connect people in disparate places, but there's also this tendency in the genre, in the way that it kind of has been done for a long time, of maybe writing about instead of writing with the people who are there, and including their voices and writing with a sense of empathy and respect instead of kind of being cynical. And it was important to me to say this is not just about my trip and what I did, but also to bring in, those important conversation starters to think of, okay, what's the context behind a lot of these encounters and what people are saying that makes it make a little bit more sense to somebody who's reading it for the first time. But also have it be an adventure that people can follow along and feel like they're traveling a little bit vicariously through me.
So I'm going to ask about 3 or 4 more questions here, and then we're going to be in a position to start taking questions from the audience. As Dean Dolan said, she's going to help us out with this, but there are microphones placed around both this tier and the tier up above. I want to ask you to reflect a little. There's a line. There were a number of really interesting lines in the course of the book that captured my attention. There was one on where you talked about valuing being out with friends and families rather than locked up at home. I think this was when you were in Estación Cocorona, although I may have that wrong. I thought about that. This was written pre-pandemic, I think, although
It was written pre-pandemic.
Your copyright is 2021, but how do you think about those things now? I mean, even at the time you say this, you have a little bit of kind of back and forth about, well, there's the freedom of being outside, but there's also just the freedom to walk away. But now we've been through this period where all of us have perforce been locked down. What's your reflection on this? Does it change the way you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been so interesting. I feel like this book and this place, one of the reasons why the place was always interesting to me from the outset, and I think one of the things that I've noticed with readers for the book, is that you can read it a number of ways depending on your own experience and where you come from and your background. But with the pandemic, I wrote it largely before the pandemic, but I think it has taken on a different meaning now from the pandemic, because suddenly everybody is reconsidering what we're doing with our time. Are we generating impact in our communities? All of these conversations started during the pandemic, during 2020, and suddenly I had this kind of book-ish looking document sitting with me about a lot of people who are making positive change and feeling like they were living their lives with purpose and passion and meaning. And again, regardless of, or I guess in the context of, in a lot of times, the underlying situations that they were facing that definitely impacted the lives that they were living. But I think a kind of a face value of speaking with people like Simón Villanueva, the filigree jeweler, Luis Soriano, the biblioburro, Luis Manuel Salamanca, the anthropologist, Alejandra, the woman who, with the injury on her arm, who accompanied me on a chalupa just because she felt free to do it because of something that had happened to her in her past. I think that there's a lot to be said about asking those questions and what can we take away from the very beautiful encounters that I had with a lot of people in this experience, and how that impacts the way we're thinking about our own lives as maybe readers of the book or people who live with these people and are now going to read the book in Spanish because it's hopefully coming out soon in Spanish. Lots of things to be thinking about, but at the end of the day, different people will take away different things, I think, from all of the characters or the people who form the substance of this book.
There are so many of these beautiful encounters in the book, and it's so hard to imagine them happening in the kinds of ways that you describe without the real presence and in-personness. And it's hard to imagine these kinds of insights without the study abroad experience that you had. There's one quote that I actually mentioned to you earlier this evening as well that really struck me, and I want to ask you to say a little more about it, and maybe how you think about it in terms of students who will have the opportunity now to study abroad since we're coming out of this pandemic. But the quote from you is, "So strange as it is, I've found that the more I travel to communities themselves out of the way and misunderstood, the more I'm forced to explain myself over and over again to different kinds of people I meet, and the better sense I'm able to make of my own identity once I'm back home." Do you think, is that just something about you? Do you think it's something about all Princeton students? How do you think about it?
I think it's something about everybody,
it's
Princeton
about everybody,
students or not, but the value of getting out and having conversations with people as a way of understanding yourself is something that has come to mark a lot of what I do in my own life and what I enjoy about, the kind of beauties of life. But I think that this stems from a conversation that I was having at Princeton with my thesis advisors. Both Daphne and Christina were really encouraging, both of them are here today, encouraging me to think about why I was drawn to this place. Me, as a person who is not Colombian, has Latin American family, but is not Colombian and has no background in this very specific river in a very specific time and place. Why was I drawn to it? And I struggled with this throughout the time that I was writing the thesis. And I think only once I was working on the book version did I realize that it was because every single place where I went, people asked me the same questions over and over again. You hear a lot in this book about the kinds of questions that I ask people, but maybe you don't get necessarily the kinds of questions that they're asking me. But every single time, I kid you not, it was the same questions.
So what were they asking you?
What does your last name mean? What is your religion? Where do you come from? And what is life like where you live in New York? Because everybody knows New York and everybody lives in New York.
And did any of these questions bother you? I mean, they might be, well, that's personal.
They didn't bother me, but sometimes I wondered, much like these people were probably wondering when I was asking them questions, how much do I reveal to a stranger about myself? But I think that I was, I come from this background that's pretty mixed in the sense that, I was born and raised in New York. My family's kind of from everywhere. And I was parsing through that. A lot, when I speak Spanish with a heavy Argentinian accent, but also a heavy American accent that shines through after some time. So, a lot of people thought I was Argentinian. A lot of people thought I was American. It took those kinds of conversations of how would I present myself at first glance? And that's a question, a subjective question that you have to ask yourself is what parts of my identity do I put forward first? And what I realized was I was putting forward the kinds of, aspects of my identity that would help forge the best connection with the person. And I think that's a valuable thing that we can all take away from, the encounters that we have, whether it's far away in another country, at Princeton with, a classmate that you get to talk to and meet on OA or orientation or whatever, right? In a class, or, in the city where you live, that you can have these conversations with people, but it's always going to be, you're always putting forward first a subjective version of yourself. And I learned that was what drew me to that place was that answering those questions over and over and over again allowed me to understand what was most important to me about my own identity and myself.
That's really interesting. Let me then ask you one more question before we let our great class of 2026 ask you. The very great class of 2026 ask a few questions. So, Jordan, I just want to bring you back to one thing way early on in this conversation as I was asking you about what got you through this project. And there was a brief reference you made to rejection as being useful to somehow bringing this book and this project to fruition. You didn't get a chance to follow up on it. What's that about? How does rejection help?
Yeah, I kind of want to level with everybody here now because, again, I was not I'm not too far out from where you guys are sitting now. You get rejected a lot at Princeton from stuff. Like, you get into Princeton, which is hard, but then you get rejected from a lot of different things, and that soon becomes normal. And I think that a lot of times there's a tendency to think of each rejection as a failure. But really, every rejection just kind of opens the door to something else. So an example of this is that I was applying for an internship the summer of my freshman year and having a conversation with an advisor in the Spanish department that I didn't know I wanted to study in the Spanish department yet either. He had said to me something to the extent of, well, you've applied to this internship. If you get the internship, it'll be great because you can do the internship and you can also go to Colombia. You probably won't get to go to Colombia for that much time, but you'll have a good time. If you get rejected from this internship, you're going to have the best summer of your life because you're going to be able to go for a long time.
And the internship was pretty cool, right?
Yeah, it was with Late Night with Seth Meyers. I really wanted to work with Late Night with Seth Meyers.
And
like,
so
that was, yeah.
Seth Meyers wasn't interested, yeah.
I'll still give the book to Seth Meyers if he wants to read the book. But I really wanted to work for Late Night with Seth Meyers. I wanted to work in TV, and I did not get that internship. I was definitely too young and inexperienced. Like, things happen. You don't get those kinds of things. But one after the next, like, I either didn't get something that I wanted to do, or I did something and realized I thought I wanted to do this, but you know what? This is not really what I'm passionate about. Maybe I'm doing this only because I feel like I should be doing it because everybody else around me is doing this. So in these little ways of realizing that certain opportunities weren't meant for me, every time I found myself gravitating back to this thing, well, why don't I go to Latin America and try something a little bit experimental? Why don't I go try to, find my family's roots in Argentina or go to Colombia and travel this river? And, as my time at Princeton went on, I realized more concretely that that was what I wanted to do, period. Like, that was what I wanted to do. But it keeps going. Like, it happens after Princeton, too. This book, as it was turning from a thesis to a book, got rejected something like 55 times.
It got rejected 55 times before it was
by
accepted.
different editors and publishing houses, because for lots of different reasons. And I remember that. And it only took one. It took one editor who had it at the bottom of her desk, at the bottom of her pile on her desk, and hadn't had a chance to look at it. And she ended up being the perfect editor for this book. I mean, it was just the perfect kind of thing that happened. And sometimes
bad news is if you want to be published, you get rejected a lot. The good news is one is all you need.
One is all you need.
You need
right,
one
exactly.
publisher. And so 1 in 54 is a winning record. And we are really glad that editor had the good sense to publish this book. Jordan, thank you. I'm going to bring Jill Dolan back. And
Excellent. What a wonderful, thoughtful conversation. It's your opportunity to ask questions. 7 microphones all around the gymnasium, I suppose. Please stand up. And all we ask is that when you speak, you introduce yourself with your name and tell us where you're from. I'm going to go right up there. Person in the blue shirt. Yes.
Awesome. My name is Colin. I'm from the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia. So I have a question. Cool.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the way you describe the environment and its effect on people in the book. Something super interesting to me. West Virginia has gone through a lot environmentally, coal mining, stuff like that. So it's kind of personal in a way. But I really liked how you described, that was a huge part of your narrative and your description. And I just wanted to ask, even from just looking at the picture on the cover, which is so handily displayed up there, the river looks super turbid in the sense that it's it's brown and you can't really see the bottom anywhere. And you talk about hearing sediment against the bottom of the boat and that it's gotten wide and shallow. And so my question as a result is, while there's a lot of grassroots efforts on other parts of conservation of the Magdalena, is there efforts to relocate these pastures that are causing deforestation or being deforested to acquire, or other ways to kind of shore up the banks so it stops widening and stops getting so messy, if you will?
It's a good question. It's really important because you very accurately tie what's happening along this river to what's happening in a lot of places around the world, including in the United States. I think that the moving of pastures is the more difficult thing.
Right.
There are people who are working towards planting certain kinds of plants along the banks of the river that hold the sediment. Leguminous plants do a really good job of their roots hold back dirt really well, so to prevent the further sedimentation. But actually, one of the main ways that people are trying to get through this now is there's a lot of talk about dredging the river, which brings a whole host of other kinds of environmental issues, but also could cause, benefits for some people. So it really is this really difficult back and forth tug of like the environment affecting people, but also people affecting the environment, right? And how those changes play off against one another. It's a really complex situation. So I don't have a good answer for you, but there are projects that are happening, along those lines. Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the question. Right down here.
Hi, my name is Manuel and I'm from California. And so as a foreign language student and journalism student, your story really resonated with me. And so I was wondering, actually I have two questions. At what point did you realize that a thesis wasn't long enough, that you wanted to really pursue publishing this book? And then my second question being, would you ever be willing to show us you singing Wonderwall?
Oh, yeah, no, that's not happening. I'm really sorry about that. Maybe I'll show you guys the videos on Instagram one day if you want to follow me on Instagram, and I'll put that up after this if you want to see the video of me playing Wonderwall. But we actually, I remember you because you reached out to me before this, and it's really great to hear that you've engaged so deeply with the book, which I really appreciate. And so I guess, when did I want this to become bigger than a thesis? I wrote the thesis with that in mind, because I think that one of the things that I want everybody to take away from this conversation is that there are a lot of people who come out of Princeton turning their theses into real-world things. You guys are far off from writing theses now, so you don't necessarily have to think about it at this moment. But as you start going through your first couple of years of the Princeton experience, think about, it doesn't necessarily have to be a book. You don't have to write something even very long. Well, theses are long. I shouldn't say that. You have to write something long for a thesis.
Depends on the department.
Depends on the thing. Yeah, there's a lot of defending that. I shouldn't say that. But no, but it doesn't have to happen basically in the way that it happened in my situation. There are people who start companies from their thesis. There are people who, use it as a starting off point to go pursue a PhD maybe. There are lots of ways where your thesis can take on greater meaning. And in my case, I wanted to become a writer and a journalist, right? As maybe you do too. And it's really hard. It's hard to do that.
Yeah, I imagine.
Yeah, and so I figured, okay, I have this year to work really hard on one piece of writing. It seemed to me to not make sense to write something that I would never look at again. It seemed to me the most wise thing to maybe do something that even if a piece of it could get published, that would be a success. And that's exactly what I thought this thesis was going to be. I thought that one chapter, if I was lucky, I'd be able to sell to a newspaper or magazine to start a freelance career. I was not thinking that this would be a book in the form that it is now. So it goes to show how things change, but also if you come into it with that mindset of, I can do things at Princeton that can have, lots of meaning and impact beyond Princeton, I think you're setting yourself up in a very good way.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Right down here.
Hello, my name is Alexandra and I'm from Paris. In Every Day the River Changes, you often refer to the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and you point to the intersection of myth and reality along the river's banks. So I wanted to know how you found that intersection in your own writing between fiction and reality, and how you tried to do justice to these stories, both what was true in them and what was imagined.
Definitely. It's a really, really important question. And to preface this, to show you how many things do change when you're working on a project like this, is I think that in the beginning I actually had it in my mind that I wanted this to be a collection of folk tales down the Magdalena River. I was really interested, especially in the kinds of stories people tell to children. I still am really interested in the kinds of stories people tell to children because, again, the way I got into this as a writer in the first place was because of the stories that I heard when I was a child, both real and imagined. And so I think that, very quickly when I got there, I realized that the folk tales that I was hearing also had great significance and said a lot about the way people were living, and also that the way people were living were having an impact on the stories that they were telling that were more imagined. And Garcia Marquez is a perfect example of the intersection of these kinds of things. But I think that this being a nonfiction book, truth is truthful encounters, that's got to be the base of it. But I also wanted to write certain chapters in a way that felt, that conveyed the specialness of the encounters that I was having with people and the stories that they were telling me and the weight that those stories had in their own lives, but always to make sure that separation was clear. But a good example of that is the Biblioburro chapter, the chapter about the traveling donkey librarian. I love Luis and I love the way he goes about his work. And there is a sense that he does it, he speaks in a sing-song way as if he's always reading to a child. And I found that so beautiful. And so I wanted to write a chapter that I thought in my mind was that could be read to a child, maybe, if possible. Things like that, I think, were like little subtle things that I tried to do in the writing to both blend those two camps, but also make sure that, like, this is a nonfiction story at its heart, because it's a journalistic project.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up top.
Hi, I'm Zach Yaninik, and I'm from Hershey, Pennsylvania. I have a question that concerns one of the sub-themes of the book, where you mention a sense of relief when outsiders arrive at Estación Concordia, because it reminded you that, unlike the people that live there, you could always leave. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how being an outsider who eventually leaves the country affects what or how much the visitor can really know about the place he visits. This also came up as you tried to get additional information about Luis Salamanca's murder. You were reminded that as a traveler in a complex country, there was still very much you would never know. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this concept.
This is a really, really important and good question. And I think that it goes back to this idea of what travel writing can look like now that we have a lot of possibilities afforded in terms of technology and wide access of technology in a lot of cases. So the first thing that I'll say is that a lot of these encounters started when I was a Princeton student, like traveling down this river, but most, if not all of them, continued for years afterwards over WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram. Like, those conversations deepened, even if the that first initial thing was like to create trust, and then we were talking over text or on the phone. That definitely influenced those encounters. But to your question of like that deeply uncomfortable feeling that comes with being a traveler, especially in a difficult place where you're noticing that people are really, struggling, and to feel this very uncomfortable sense of relief that other people are also outsiders and that you could all leave, is one that I'm still grappling with as a writer doing all these kinds of this kind of work. But I think it was important to mention it, because if I didn't mention it, I wouldn't be being truthful in all that I was doing. And I think that kind of, context to provide from my own perspective also, kind of shapes the viewpoint of the writer, which is really important in a book like this, to understand where the writer is coming from, what that writer is feeling when traveling in this way. But it makes for so many different kinds of challenges. And the Salamanca thing is a prime example. Like, I couldn't go back because of the pandemic and for other reasons. But it's just really hard. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but I think that it's important just to, from the outset, be honest about your perspective when writing a story like this, because otherwise that divide is just going to be bigger and bigger. And you have to embrace it sometimes and just say, like, these conversations are informed by it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up here.
Hi, Jordan. My name is Hayden Hayosky, from a small town in Stockdale, South Central Texas. And a funny thing happened as I was reading the book this summer. I was on a trip with my godmother and some cousins, and she was asking me about college and things like that, and I told her how I was reading the book. And as I just started explaining the general concept to her, because she's from Colombia, and as I just started explaining the general concept to her, the premise of the book, I just saw her eyes light up and just this big smile come across her face. And she explained to me how that meant so much to her, that something like that was being told, because, it's such a... Not many stories like that are told, not many perspectives like that are brought to light. And so I was just curious as to if you have any experiences with people from Colombia or people of Colombian descent. Have they come up to you and told you about how your book has affected them and how that has affected you?
Yeah, I'm, first of all, so thankful and glad that you brought this up, because that is a really beautiful thing to hear, and it makes me very happy to hear that your godmother felt that way about the book, so please thank her for me. Also, I have been very fortunate to give this book to a lot of people, both in Colombia and Colombian Americans who live here, and getting their perceptions about the book has been great, because a lot of it has been this sense of joy, not necessarily like, pure joy, but just at least this sense that there are other kinds, like there's lots of stories that encapsulate a life and an existence in any place in the world. And when one feels, and this was a conversation I had with lots of people throughout the Magdalena Valley when I was traveling, is that they felt very self-conscious about the fact that their country had a certain reputation in that broader world. And so going back to the previous question about being an outsider in a complex place and what is the responsibility of an outsider to build these kinds of bridges, how to do it in a respectful way was really important to me. And in this book, particularly this project from Thesis to Book, was to tell stories that were largely stories of beauty and hope that were also informed by these more complex historical contexts. And I hope that that's what the final product is. And from the people who I've spoken with, people seem to be really happy about it. Now, again, like this book is coming out in Colombia in a couple months, and I will love to hear what people think then. But for now, I'm just thrilled to hear that this is another example of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right here.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm from Berkeley, California. And I really enjoyed reading your book. And I guess one of the reasons for that was there were so many different experiences and places you visited. And I was just wondering, of all the places you visited, what was your favorite? And I guess what was like your favorite or most meaningful experience?
This is hard because it changes all the time. It's like asking me what my favorite Beatles song is. Every week it's a different one. But what am I feeling today? Because for this audience, I think that it's important to I've been thinking a lot about, well, two people, but I have to pick one. And I'm going to pick Alejandra because she seems to be the wild card surprise that I thought people were going to maybe glance over a little bit, but so many readers have found a kinship with her and been inspired by her story because she had a moment in her life where everything changed and she could have lost it all. And now she lives her life in a way that, yes, is informed by so many different situations that she's going through, but at the end of the day, she's doing what she's excited about, what is passionate to her, and what excites her, what makes her get up every day. And I think that here at a place like Princeton, you're in a very unique and privileged position to be able to follow a lot of these threads of maybe a little bit obscure passions that are really exciting to you. And in thinking about people like Alejandra or Simón Villanueva, the filigree jeweler, I want everybody to, as a kind of exercise with this book, think about how you can create those little moments of beauty and passion in your own communities, right? And that have impact, that have purpose, and bring that to your experience here, but also after you leave. But having that mindset from the beginning is really important. And I think that Alejandra, a person like her, who is a dear friend of mine still, I talk to her all the time, and she has heard that people really, have empathized with her story. I think that it's something that people have taken away and that I hope all of you will take away too.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Samuel from El Paso, Texas. I also love the Beatles. I have kind of a two-part question. The first part question is one of the most interesting parts of the story is when you were talking to Salchi and about Captain Rosso, about how when the Magdalena River started dying, that's when a lot of the indigenous communities and all the communities along the Magdalena also started seeing degradation of their community, lack of connection to the outside world. So I guess my question is, what parallels can we draw between the onset of industrialization and the interstate highway system in the United States of America during like the 1950s to that same kind of simultaneous development in Colombia during the 1950s and its effect on minority communities? And I guess my second question is, as an author, how did you tote the line between writing about these communities in a manner that cherishes them versus in an exploitive manner as others have done?
First of all, unfortunately, I don't really know that much about the history of the interstate highway system in the U.S., so I don't know if I can make that comparison in the detailed way that you maybe would want me to. But I know what you mean. I know that there are parallels that can be drawn about what we call quote-unquote development in whatever sense, right, and industrialization and the impact it can have on the environment and the people who are affected most by things like climate change and environmental degradation. I think that what I wanted this book to do was to include and center the local voices of people as much as possible, and to be able to have them tell their experiences and tell those experiences the way they were told to me, instead of writing about my opinion about it. So that, as a writer in my sense, and also again, as not an expert, not an authoritative source on, as a student who's traveling down a river and having these encounters with people, I wanted to make sure that I was doing it in a sensitive way that was very clear, again, going back to the important question from up there, clear about the dynamics that existed between me and the people whose lives I was entering, whose homes I was entering, whose communities I was, learning about. I wanted to be kind of always respectful of that, and yeah, that was just kind of the guiding principle of this book.
Thank you.
Let's go up here. Yes. All good.
Hi, my name is Desiree Rivers, and I'm from Philadelphia, up here.
Hi. Yes, hi. Sorry, there's lights. That
Yeah,
make
there
it
are very bright
very
lights
difficult.
on us. So
Yeah.
I have a serious question and a not so serious question. You get to choose.
Give me the not so serious question. I'm sweating a lot.
Would you ever want to write a moto marinera again?
Yes. Oh my God, it was so much fun. All the danger that, aside, the moto marinera, if those of you don't remember what it was this like platform on an abandoned railroad track that had rail wheels along the bottom and was powered by a motorcycle through the darkness. It was totally, definitely not safe, probably the most unsafe thing that I did in the entire trip, but it was also the most fun. And I will never forget the feeling of the wind in my face jetting through the darkness on this motorcycle improvised train, seeing eagles jetting out from their like hiding places and silent lightning. Like, it's just one of those moments that just gets drilled into your mind and you never forget. So yes, I would do it again in a heartbeat.
An excellent question.
Which is funny because my next question is about danger and risk. You remind me a lot of my mother, who traveled 2 times during the pandemic, once to the Bahamas and once to Egypt. And I'm pretty sure Quijana, Colombia is definitely up there on the top 10 sites for tourist travel. But my question is, how did you put that fear aside of whatever could happen in Colombia, like you could get kidnapped or held by the FARC.
So what I didn't want to do was make that the center of the story, because the truth is, as I was saying before, it's like I made very calculated plans for this trip, and I did the trip in the first place because it was a moment of relative calm when I felt like I could do it safely. And I think that it all goes back to this thing of like knowing what risks are and what they mean, what calculated risks are worth taking, and what's not worth it. Thanks for the question. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So listen, everyone. I know there are lots of people lined up at microphones. I wish that we could take all your questions. What I'd like to encourage you to do is hang on to them and take them with you to your Z group conversations, which are happening, if I understand correctly, right after this event. Probably in the interest of the temperature, we should call it quits for now. But also, correct me if I'm wrong, Jordan will be speaking with President Eisgruber at various conversations in the colleges?
So we're really fortunate that most years our pre-read author is with us for this one day, and you can either ask a question then or correspond. We're fortunate that Jordan Salama is going to be with us at Princeton for the next 6 weeks, I think. Do I have that right? Yeah, 6 weeks. So we will be heading out into the res colleges, and we have sessions set up there, and there will be other opportunities to talk to him. So for those of you who are interested in exploring this or asking him questions, we'll have that opportunity.
I hope you'll all take advantage of those opportunities. Please join me in thanking President Eisgruber and Jordan Salama.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was terrific. You did a fantastic job. That was great. Yeah, I think